Down these mean streets a man must go who is not himself mean, who is neither tarnished nor afraid. He is the hero. He is everything. He must be a complete man and a common man and yet an unusual man. He must be, to use a rather weathered phrase, a man of honor, by instinct, by inevitability, without thought of it, and certainly without saying it. He must be the best man in his world and a good enough man for any world. He will take no man's money dishonestly and no man's insolence without a due and dispassionate revenge. He is a lonely man, and his pride is that you will treat him as a proud man, or be very sorry you ever saw him. The story is this man's adventure in search of a hidden truth, and it would be no adventure if it did not happen to a man fit for adventure. If there were enough like him, the world would be a very safe place to live in, without becoming too dull to be worth living in. That's from Raymond Chandler's 1950 essay on crime fiction entitled The Simple Art of Murder. It was also the title of an anthology of his short, early fiction of the same name. And it encapsulates the private eye for, those of us who work in that genre ever since. And you could point to just about any work of private eye fiction, and your protagonist, male or female, is going to roughly fit that mold. I'm sure there are exceptions. I can't think of any off the top of my head. Quick biographical sketch. Raymond Chandler is born in Chicago in 1888. Spends some of his early life out in the western U.S. His parents divorce. His mother moves him to England. His mother is from Ireland. They live there with relatives. He is schooled there, goes to university, lives there until, I believe, 1912. He returns to the U.S., lives in San Francisco for a while, joins the Canadian Army, serves in trench warfare in World War I, comes back to the U.S., trains as a bookkeeper, eventually goes to work for an oil company. By 1932, he has risen to the rank of vice president in that oil company. 32 is also when he is fired for being, frankly, a degenerate alcoholic and having affairs with female employees. Also, by that time, he has married a woman 18 years his senior, after being engaged to her for several years until Chandler's mother dies. He refused to marry without her permission. He eventually had to wait out her existence. So, 32, 33, 34, height of the Depression. Raymond Chandler's out of work. Gone from executive to nothing. And as he's driving all over the state of California looking for work, he begins reading detective magazines. Dime Detective, of course, the aforementioned Black Mask magazine. Now, back in England, for a while after the war, Chandler had a very brief career, not only in the British Civil Service, but also as a journalist, not unlike the young Ian Fleming. It didn't last long, but after reading these detective stories, Chandler's looking at them and thinking, I can do this. And so he does. His first published story is in Black Mask in 1935, and for a few years after that, he's writing about private detectives by the names of Dalmas, Carmody, Mallory. All of these are prototypes for Philip Marlowe, who will be the detective he debuts in his first novel, The Big Sleep. And you can, if you read those old stories, again, in the Simple Art of Murder collection or in another collection called Trouble Is My Business, you can see the bits and pieces that Chandler cannibalizes for his later novels. The Lady in the Lake is Exhibit A in this process. He lifted big chunks of previous work to fit into that. Also, if you look on YouTube, you can see HBO in the 1980s aired a Philip Marlowe TV show starring Powers Booth in the title role. And most of those stories, although the guy in them was called Philip Marlowe, they were drawn from earlier short fiction, that had featured detectives of other names, stories such as The Pencil or The King in Yellow. Highly recommended. As far as I know, it's not available legitimately anywhere, but it's been about a year, but there were definitely some on YouTube. So Chandler's first novel, Big Sleep, 1939. Last novel, 1959, Playback. He died leaving 4 chapters of an uncompleted novel called Poodle Springs. Poodle Springs would later be completed by Robert B. Parker, the author of not only the Spencer stories, but 2 other private eye series, rather, well, 1 police series, 1 private eye series, and a series of westerns. Parker, who we will talk about at some point, guy just over here, over my left shoulder in the very corner with the dog, a Chandler acolyte. Spencer resembles no previous private eye quite so much as he resembles Philip Marlowe. Indeed, Marlowe, along with Ross MacDonald and Dashiell Hammett, was one of the 3 authors upon whom Robert Parker wrote his doctoral dissertation. Again, that stuff's coming. Chandler never got over his alcoholism. It plagued him until the end of his life. It was always a roadblock to his productivity. He did, however, do some work in Hollywood, probably more successfully, certainly more successfully than Dashiell Hammett did. And Chandler is to Robert B. Parker as Hammett is to Chandler. Chandler held Hammett in an esteem that he held, to my knowledge, no other previous or concurrent in his era author. And he saw in Hammett a level of not just artistry, but realism and legitimacy that he saw in no one else. Chandler, the novel we're going to talk about today, I guess we'll go straight to that, is Chandler's The Long Goodbye. It is his longest novel. It is widely regarded, not simply by me, as his best novel. And as Hammett did with Red Harvest, Chandler in The Long Goodbye attempts to elevate the private eye novel beyond where it had been previously, both in his own work and others. I think the easiest way to explain The Long Goodbye is that it is a straight-ahead 1950s type literary, mainstream novel that just happens to be about a guy who's a private investigator. There is existential despair in there. There is an oblique examination by Chandler through a couple of the characters of his own alcoholism, of his own alcohol-related limitations as an author. We'll get into that a little more in a second. Its plotting is more complicated than any of his previous novels. Although, there are 2 cases running side by side over the course of the book, and they dovetail neatly at the end. He wraps everything up in a tidy, if very depressing, bow by the end of it. With this novel, actually with his career in general, Chandler spans both the hard-boiled and noir movements in literature. He's really the guy that provides the bridge between those 2 things, because hard-boiled is a 1930s, 1940s, and noir is a post-war to about 1960s movement. These dates are approximate and open to a great deal of argument and interpretation. A brief plot summary, as brief as we can be, about The Long Goodbye. Working on a case at a nightclub, Philip Marlowe sees a guy, a drunk, a guy who's just barking, knee-walking drunk, get dumped by the woman he's with. I mean, not simply she dumps him in their relationship, she literally dumps the guy out of his car, leaves him in the gravel parking lot of this nightclub. Marlowe takes it upon himself to rescue this guy, who turns out his name is Terry Lennox, who is an American who served in the British Special Forces unit called the Special Air Services, and was captured by the Germans after a commando raid in Norway in 1942. who, suffered burns, has had plastic surgery, and also as a result of his wartime experiences, again, much probably like Chandler, is an alcoholic. So Lennox and Marlowe begin a friendship. Both of them are middle-aged and otherwise, practically solitary men. Marlowe has a couple of buddies on the force. Bernie Oles, who works for the LA District Attorney's Office, and an LAPD missing persons cop named Violet McGee. But he doesn't really have any close friends. Marlowe's life, as we've seen in the books up to this point, is pretty depressing. He goes out, has rudimentary romantic involvement with women, nothing long term. And most of the time he goes out, works the cases, gets his head beat in, gets punched out all the time. People shoot at him, tie him up, shoot him full of dope. And after all that, he goes home and he's got nothing. He's got like not quite a studio apartment, but a very small apartment. And there's a few of them in different locations over the course of the novels. And he plays chess against himself. He sets out problems on the board, and that's a big night. That and some whiskey is a big night for Philip Marlowe. One night, Terry Lennox comes to him and says, "Please drive me to Tijuana." And and he almost tells Marlowe why. Marlowe insists upon not being told why Terry needs this ride to Mexico, because he wants the plausible deniability of not knowing, but he knows it's something terrible. Drives Lennox to an airport in Tijuana. From there, Lennox takes off. Marlowe knows not where. Marlowe comes back. LAPD is waiting for him. It turns out that Lennox's wife has been murdered by persons or persons unknown. Marlowe doesn't want to believe that Lennox did this. He wants to believe that Lennox merely ran knowing that he was going to be suspected of it. That's part one. Part two is a very famous romance writer named Roger Wade, who is also a slobbering alcoholic, also a World War II veteran, has an insoluble case of writer's block. Marlowe is hired by Wade's wife and Wade's literary agent to nursemaid Wade through the process to, if possible, keep him from drinking and keep him productive. Eventually, in the course of the story, Wade is murdered by persons or persons unknown. In the meantime of that, while fooling around with the Wades, Marlowe meets a woman named Linda Loring. And unfortunately, she's married, but her husband's a butthead dentist who also can't hold his liquor particularly well and accuses his wife of cheating even when she doesn't. She eventually leaves him for Marlowe. And one of the things at the end of the book is we don't know what's going to happen with Marlowe and Loring's nascent romance. That's not too much of a spoiler. And speaking of which, I don't want to spoil how the two other concurrent storylines dovetail. But it's a fairly sprawling novel by private eye book standards. And there's actually a decent sized middle section between the Lennox case and the Wade case that are vignettes, days in the life of Philip Marlowe as a working private eye, where he has to solve, he has to find like a missing dog, that kind of stuff. But through it all is a very sad and melancholy, almost a journalistic report on Marlowe's bummer of a life. And it's not surprising that some of this was written after the death of Marlowe's wife, who, as we said, is much older than he was. So it's worth checking out, not just for its quality as a crime novel, but for its quality as an overall novel. It's the best work Chandler ever did. And he did pretty good work. None of his novels are bad. Even the very last one, Playback, which is probably the worst of the batch, is not a bad book by any means. It's actually still head and shoulders above a lot of work in the genre. But there were dips. And if I had more time to go into it, I'd rank Raymond Chandler's novels. I don't, but if you read through them, you're probably, your opinions may vary. You're going to find that there are dips in the quality. Again, none of them bad. All of them worth reading and not simply for students of the genre. As always, if you can, start with the very first one. Long Goodbye is the best one. Work your way up to it. Start with The Big Sleep. If you like The Big Sleep, keep on going. Eventually work your way back around to the early short fiction. It's embryonic forms of what he would later do. Again, this stuff's still worth reading, much better than most of the pulp fiction of its era. Next week, I'm not entirely sure what we're going to do. I'm thinking about just concentrating on the main authors, and then working my way up to the modern era like that, probably more quickly than I had originally anticipated with this series. And then we can work backwards in bits and pieces, and I can further expand. As you can see from the Wall of Fame, such as it is behind me, crime fiction from its early days until relatively recently, until really just about the last 25, 30 years, not a particularly diverse group. Yeah, a lot of white guys. That's a function of the literary establishment. It's a function of the genre itself in some ways. That has changed. Even in the time period, even let's say 1930s to the 1980s, there were other sorts of authors working in the genre, and we're going to look at those. We're going to blast probably through these guys first, get ourselves up to the modern era, see where we are, take stock, and then come back some. Thank you all again for watching this. I appreciate your time. Hope you like it. Follow us at Xenobooks on social media. Subscribe to the YouTube channel. Sign up for notifications. Of course, look below in the description for links to buy Raymond Chandler's work, to buy associated work, to buy my work. Thank you again if you do any of that, and we will see you later on. Goodbye.